Servant Girl Annihilator. Between December 1884 and December 1885, a series of attacks terrorized Austin, Texas, in what would become recognized as one of America's earliest documented serial offenses. The perpetrator targeted victims as they slept in their homes, wielding an axe to render them unconscious before dragging them outside for additional harm. 8 individuals were taken. Molly Smith on December 30th, 1884. Eliza Shelley on May 6th, 1885. Irene Cross on May 22nd, 1885. Mary Ramey on August 30th, 1885. Gracie Vance in Orange, Washington on September 28th, 1885, and Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, both on December 24th, 1885. The victims consisted primarily of black women working as domestic servants, plus one black man who was Vance's companion. In addition to the 8 fatalities, 8 individuals survived severe attacks, including several men. Among them Walter Spencer, Rebecca Ramey, and the children of some of the deceased victims. The method employed by the perpetrator demonstrated calculated brutality. Victims were positioned in similar manners after being dragged from their residences, and in some cases, sharp implements were inserted into their ears. The attacks occurred during nighttime hours when victims were most vulnerable, suggesting the perpetrator had observed residential patterns and knew when occupants would be sleeping. The use of an axe as the initial weapon indicated either accessibility to such tools through occupation or deliberate selection for its effectiveness in causing immediate incapacitation. The investigation faced substantial challenges given the forensic limitations of the 1880s. Over 400 men were arrested during the course of the investigation, though none were definitively convicted for the series of attacks. James Phillips was tried for the demise of his wife, Eula Phillips, but was convicted initially before the verdict was overturned due to insufficient evidence. Moses Hancock faced trial for Susan Hancock's passing, but was acquitted. The inability to secure convictions reflected both the evidentiary standards of the era and the difficulty in connecting suspects to the crimes without modern forensic tools. A New York Times report from the period characterized the perpetrator as a cunning madman insane on killing women, reflecting contemporary attempts to understand the motivations behind such acts. The racial composition of the victims generated significant discussion within Austin's community, with some suggesting racial animus played a role, while others viewed the targeting as opportunistic based on the vulnerable living situations of domestic servants. Members of the African American community believed the perpetrator possessed supernatural abilities to avoid detection, as no dogs alerted to his presence during the attacks. The attacks ceased abruptly in late 1885, with no additional incidents reported after December of that year. This sudden cessation led investigators to theorize the perpetrator had either died, been imprisoned for unrelated offenses, or fled Austin. Modern analysis applying psychological profiling techniques has pointed toward Nathan Elgin as a possible suspect. Elgin was a 19-year-old cook who was missing a toe, matching a footprint discovered at one of the crime scenes. He resided in proximity to several victims and had access to their neighborhoods through his work. Elgin was taken by police in 1886 while attacking another individual, ending his life before he could face questioning about the servant attacks. Author O. Henry, who lived in Austin during this period, wrote in a letter, "Town is fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the servant girl annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night, capturing the atmosphere of fear that gripped the city." The case shocked Texas by demonstrating that a growing urban center remained vulnerable to predatory individuals who could evade capture despite intensive investigation. The attacks prompted the formation of patrol groups and heightened vigilance throughout Austin neighborhoods, though these measures came too late to prevent the series of tragedies. The case predated the Jack the Ripper incidents in London by 3 years, establishing the servant girl annihilator as one of the earliest serial offenders in documented criminal history. But decades later, Another case would demonstrate how modern technology could finally unlock answers. Yogurt shop murders. On December 6, 1991, 4 individuals were discovered deceased inside an I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. The victims were bound and positioned unclothed before being shot in their heads. The perpetrator had set fire to the establishment in an apparent attempt to destroy forensic evidence, though the flames activated sprinkler systems that extinguished the blaze before complete destruction occurred. The combination of fire and water damage severely compromised the crime scene, complicating early forensic analysis and evidence collection efforts. The victims had been working closing shifts at the yogurt shop when they were confronted by the perpetrator. Biological evidence recovered from the scene indicated assault had occurred prior to the shootings. The bindings used on the victims suggested premeditation and control tactics employed by someone experienced in dominating multiple individuals simultaneously. The execution style, nature of the shootings, with each victim receiving wounds to the head, indicated the perpetrator sought to ensure no survivors who could provide identification or testimony. The investigation initially pursued numerous leads as Austin police worked to identify suspects who might have had knowledge of the yogurt shop's operations or who had been observed in the vicinity during the evening of December 6th. In 1999, 8 years after the incident, authorities arrested 4 individuals: Maurice Pierce, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn, based on confessions obtained during interrogations. Both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were sentenced to death in 2001 and 2002 respectively, though Scott's sentence was later commuted to life before both convictions were overturned in 2007. However, appellate review in 2007 determined that the trials had been conducted unfairly and that DNA evidence excluded these individuals as contributors to the biological material recovered from the victims. All charges were dropped in 2009, and exoneration proceedings commenced in 2025. The breakthrough in identifying the actual perpetrator arrived through advances in DNA analysis techniques. In 2025, sophisticated YSTR DNA testing of biological evidence recovered from one victim's fingernails and a .380 caliber casing found at the scene generated a profile matching Robert Eugene Brasher's. Brasher's had taken his own life in 1999 following a standoff with law enforcement, approximately 8 years after the yogurt shop incident. Subsequent investigation revealed Brasher's had been connected to at least 8 other intentional takings of life across multiple states, establishing him as a serial offender who had evaded capture for years. On October 2, 2024, Austin Police Chief Lisa Davis and DA Jose Garza announced that a DNA profile from the scene matched Robert Brasher's, a serial killer who died in 1999. District Attorney Jose Garza noted, "The overwhelming weight of the evidence points to the guilt of one man and the innocence of 4. Acknowledging both the identification of Brasher's as the actual perpetrator and the wrongful convictions of the 4 men who had spent years imprisoned before exoneration." The motive for Brasher's attack on the yogurt shop employees has never been definitively established, though his pattern of serial offending suggests he selected victims opportunistically based on vulnerability and accessibility rather than through any personal connection or specific grievance. The case shocked Texas not only for the brutality inflicted upon the victims, but also for the wrongful convictions that resulted from the initial investigation. The resolution through DNA evidence demonstrated both the power of modern forensic techniques and the fallibility of earlier investigative methods that relied on confessions without adequate corroborating physical evidence. The families of the victims received some measure of closure through the identification of Brasher's, though the fact that he died before being charged prevented any trial or public accounting of his actions. Yet another case would remain unresolved despite decades of investigation: Lover's Lane murders. In August 1990, Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson were discovered deceased in a wooded area off Enclave Parkway in Houston, Texas. The couple had spent the evening at a nightclub called Bayou Mamas before traveling to the secluded location. Cheryl Henry, 22 years old, had been subjected to assault before being fatally wounded through stabbing to her throat. Andy Atkinson, 21 years old, had been secured to a tree with ligatures and received severe throat injuries that nearly resulted in decapitation. Golf clubs were positioned to mark Henry's body, which had been placed beneath boards at the scene. A $20 bill was discovered near her remains, though its significance to the crime has never been determined. The forensic examination of the scene generated biological evidence that would later prove crucial to investigative efforts. DNA recovered from the scene matched biological evidence from a separate assault that occurred in 1990 in the Houston area, suggesting the perpetrator had engaged in at least one additional criminal act. This connection indicated the possibility of a serial offender operating in the region, though no additional definitive links to other cases have been publicly announced. The DNA profile has remained unmatched in criminal databases, indicating the perpetrator either had no prior arrests requiring DNA submission or successfully avoided detection for all subsequent criminal activities. In 2017, investigators worked with forensic artists to generate a composite sketch based on the DNA profile, utilizing emerging techniques that could predict physical characteristics from genetic material. The sketch was circulated publicly in hopes that someone would recognize the individual depicted and provide information leading to identification. However, no credible leads emerged from this publicity effort, and the perpetrator has remained unidentified through 3 decades of investigation. Federal Bureau of Investigation profilers who examined the case suggested the perpetrator may have had prior knowledge of Henry and Atkinson or had observed them during their evening at the nightclub. The selection of a secluded wooded location indicated familiarity with the area and understanding of where couples might go for privacy. The extreme brutality of the attack, particularly the near decapitation of Atkinson while he was secured to the tree, suggested rage or psychological disturbance beyond what would be necessary to cause death. Stephanie Craig, Cheryl Henry's sister, has been the primary advocate for the case, frequently speaking to the media about the trauma of the 1990 discovery. Garland Atkinson, Andy's father, expressed the particular horror of his son's final moments. He was tied to a tree and listened to her scream. That's hard to accept. Acknowledging the psychological torment Andy experienced before his own demise, the case remains officially open with the Houston Police Department, with investigators periodically reviewing evidence as DNA analysis techniques evolve and databases expand to include more comparison samples. The failure to identify the perpetrator after 35 years has generated frustration among the families, who continue to seek resolution and accountability for the acts committed against their loved ones. The unsolved status represents one of Houston's most notorious cold cases, haunting the community and serving as a reminder of the limitations that can persist even with modern forensic capabilities when a perpetrator successfully avoids inclusion in comparison databases. Some cases blur the line between intentional acts and tragic accidents. Natasha Ashley. On May 3, 1992, 19-year-old Natasha Ashley was discovered deceased inside the trunk of her Chevrolet Camaro on a rural road in San Jacinto County, Texas. Her body had been subjected to fire, with substantial thermal damage complicating forensic examination. The vehicle was located in a remote area removed from main thoroughfares, suggesting either Ashley had driven there herself or the car had been transported to the location by another individual. Ashley had attended a gathering in the town of Shepherd the previous evening, where substances were reportedly present. The initial investigation classified Ashley's passing as a homicide based on the presence of accelerants detected during forensic analysis. Drip gas and other flammable materials were identified at the scene, suggesting the fire had been deliberately set rather than occurring accidentally. This finding led investigators to pursue theories involving intentional harm by one or more individuals who had been present at the gathering, or who had encountered Ashley after she departed, while several individuals were questioned and rumors of a group assault persisted for decades. No individuals were ever formally arrested or charged with assault or homicide in direct connection to Ashley's death, a fact that has long fueled her family's frustration with the initial investigation. However, alternative theories emerged as investigators continued examining the circumstances. Former prosecutor Kelly Siegler analyzed the evidence and concluded, "I think it was a horribly tragic accident. I don't know what started the fire." Siegler's theory suggested Ashley may have been incapacitated by substances consumed at the gathering and inadvertently caused a fire through actions such as smoking while in the vehicle's trunk area. The thermal damage to the body and vehicle could have resulted from this accidental ignition rather than deliberate arson by another party. Ashley's brother, Chad Woodard, disputed this accident theory, stating, "There's too many other unexplained things. There had to have been another burning substance." Woodard pointed to forensic findings regarding the accelerants and questioned how an accidental fire could have generated the thermal intensity documented at the scene. The family maintained that Ashley had been the victim of intentional harm by individuals who either killed her before setting the fire or caused her demise through the arson itself while she was alive but incapacitated. The debate between accident and homicide theories has persisted throughout the decades since 1992. The physical evidence permits interpretations supporting either scenario, with the presence of accelerants suggesting deliberate action, while the circumstances at the gathering providing a potential explanation for how Ashley might have ended up in the trunk through her own impaired choices. The inability to definitively establish whether another individual was present when the fire commenced has prevented resolution of this fundamental question. The case remains officially open with the Texas Rangers, who maintain it as an active cold case despite the passage of over 3 decades. No suspects have been publicly identified beyond the 2 individuals who faced dropped charges in the immediate aftermath. The lack of witnesses who could describe Ashley's movements after she departed the gathering has created an investigative gap that conventional methods have been unable to fill. The case represents the challenges that arise when physical evidence can support multiple narratives and when substance use by the victim complicates efforts to reconstruct events with certainty. Another victim would wait over 40 years for her identity to be known. Sherry Jarvis. In 1980, an individual's remains were discovered along Interstate 45 in Huntsville, Texas. The body was found unclothed, bearing evidence of strangulation and prior assault involving a blunt implement. Bite marks were documented on the remains, providing potential forensic evidence for future comparison should a suspect be identified. The victim remained unidentified for over 4 decades, becoming one of numerous Jane Doe cases along the Interstate 45 corridor that investigators theorized might be connected to serial activity in the region. The victim's identity was finally established in 2021 through genetic genealogy techniques, revealing her to be Sherry Ann Jarvis. Jarvis had been reported as a runaway from her residence, leading to initial assumptions that she had voluntarily departed and would eventually return. Sherry's family had actually filed a missing persons report shortly after she ran away in 1980, but due to a clerical error or lack of communication between jurisdictions, the report was removed from the system after a few years, leaving her unidentified until 2021. While a DNA profile was successfully built from her remains, the bite mark evidence was not preserved in a way that allowed for a DNA extraction of the perpetrator. Investigators instead rely on DNA recovered from other biological material found at the scene. DNA extraction from these samples generated a profile of the unknown perpetrator, though this profile has not matched any individuals in criminal databases. The lack of a database match indicates the perpetrator either has never been arrested for offenses requiring DNA submission, has died before his profile could be entered into databases, or has successfully avoided detection for all subsequent criminal activities through the 4 decades since Jarvis's passing. Investigators have explored potential connections between Jarvis's case and other unsolved incidents along Interstate 45, which has become known for a concentration of similar offenses. The corridor has been dubbed an area of particular concern due to the number of bodies discovered along its route and the patterns suggesting possible serial activity. However, no definitive forensic links have been publicly announced connecting Jarvis's case to other specific victims, leaving open the question of whether she encountered an isolated offender or someone responsible for multiple acts. The identification of Jarvis provided her family with answers about her fate after 41 years of uncertainty, though it did not advance the identification of her killer. The case remains open with Texas law enforcement, which continues to seek information from anyone who might have knowledge about Jarvis's movements in 1980, or who might recognize the DNA profile when compared against genealogical databases. The resolution of her identity demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy to provide closure to families even when conventional identification methods had failed for decades, though it also highlighted the ongoing challenge of identifying perpetrators when their DNA is not present in comparison databases. The next case would provide chilling video evidence, yet still elude resolution. Terry Bevers. On April 18, 2016, Terry "Missy" Bevers arrived at Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian, Texas, to prepare for the fitness class she instructed. She was discovered deceased inside the church at approximately 5 in the morning, having been struck with an implement that caused fatal head trauma. The attack had occurred in the early morning darkness before other class participants arrived, with the perpetrator apparently lying in wait for Bevers inside the church building. Surveillance footage showed the individual in police tactical gear with the word "police" emblazoned on the back and chest, leading investigators to believe the perpetrator intended to use the authority of a uniform to either gain access or confuse anyone they encountered. The individual moved with a distinctive outward-pointing gait, duck-footed, that some observers characterized as unusual, possibly indicating an injury, medical condition, or deliberate attempt to disguise normal walking patterns. The footage showed the individual carrying what investigators determined to be the implement used in the attack on Bevers. The tactical gear worn by the perpetrator complicated efforts to determine physical characteristics, such as build, gender, or identifying features, as the equipment obscured the body and face. The investigation has generated thousands of tips from the public, with individuals suggesting potential suspects based on the gait visible in the surveillance footage or other circumstantial factors. Midlothian police have pursued numerous leads and conducted extensive interviews with individuals who had connections to Bevers through her fitness instruction, personal relationships, or community activities. However, no arrests have been made despite 8 years of investigation, and no suspect has been publicly identified as the primary focus of ongoing inquiry. The motive for the attack on Bevers has been the subject of substantial speculation. The fact that the perpetrator was already inside the church when Bevers arrived suggests premeditation and specific targeting rather than a random encounter. The use of tactical gear indicates planning and concern about either being identified or potentially encountering resistance. Some theories have suggested the attack stemmed from personal grievances, while others have proposed burglary that escalated when Bevers arrived unexpectedly, though this latter theory seems inconsistent with the evidence of the perpetrator waiting inside the building. The distinctive gait visible in the surveillance footage has been analyzed by various experts, with some suggesting it indicates a permanent physical condition, while others argue it appears deliberately affected. The ambiguity about whether the gait represents genuine physical characteristics or disguise has complicated efforts to narrow the suspect pool. The tactical gear has similarly generated debate about whether it represents genuine law enforcement or security equipment, or was costume-like material purchased or assembled specifically for this act. The case remains open with Midlothian police, with a reward offered for information leading to the identification and arrest of the perpetrator. The extensive publicity surrounding the case, combined with the availability of surveillance footage showing the suspect, has made this one of Texas's most discussed unsolved incidents. The failure to achieve resolution despite the video evidence has generated frustration within the community and among Bevers's family members, who continue to seek accountability for the act that took her life while she was engaged in her routine fitness instruction work. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The pattern of unsolved tragedies would continue across Texas communities. Kenesha Siobhan Dixon. On May 9, 2000, Kenesha Siobhan Dixon answered the door at her Houston apartment and was immediately shot without any apparent provocation or exchange of words. Kenesha Dixon was holding a .38 caliber revolver that belonged to her roommate. Investigators believe she had it in her hand as a defensive measure due to a prior altercation she had earlier that same day with a group of individuals at the apartment complex. The positioning of the weapon suggested she had been attempting to protect herself when the shooting occurred, though the perpetrator fired before an anti-confrontation could develop beyond the opening of the door. The immediate nature of the shooting indicated either the perpetrator had intended to harm Dixon the moment visual contact was established, or had reacted to seeing the weapon in her possession. The circumstances suggested Dixon may have had reason to fear whoever was at the door, or that she had adopted a general practice of answering with a weapon due to concerns about safety in the area. Her recent relocation to the apartment indicated she had not been at the residence for an extended period, potentially limiting who would have known her specific address and could have targeted her at this new location. The roommate who owned the firearm was questioned by investigators as part of the initial inquiry, though authorities determined the roommate had no involvement in the shooting and was providing Dixon with the weapon for defensive purposes, given concerns about neighborhood safety or specific threats Dixon may have mentioned. The fact that Dixon felt compelled to arm herself before opening the door raises questions about whether she had received threats prior to the shooting or whether she had adopted this practice as general precaution. If she had been receiving threats or had expressed concerns about specific individuals to friends or family, this information either was not communicated to investigators or did not generate investigative leads that could be pursued successfully. The possibility exists that Dixon knew or suspected who might be at the door based on the knock pattern, time of day, or other contextual factors that prompted her to retrieve the weapon before answering. Houston police conducted neighborhood canvassing following the incident, interviewing residents of adjacent apartments and individuals who had been in the vicinity during the time frame when the shooting occurred. However, no witnesses came forward with information about seeing someone approach Dixon's door or flee from the location after the shooting. The lack of witnesses complicated efforts to develop a description of the perpetrator or identify vehicles that might have been used to travel to and from the scene. The apartment complex layout and the time of day may have meant few residents were positioned where they could observe Dixon's doorway, or witnesses may have heard the gunshot but not connected it immediately to a need to observe and report suspicious individuals departing the area. The forensic examination documented the gunshot injuries Dixon sustained and recovered the projectile for ballistic analysis. While the perpetrator's weapon was never found, police recovered Dixon's weapon at the scene. Forensics confirmed it had not been fired, indicating she was killed before she could defend herself. Ballistic testing of the recovered projectile did not match any weapons in law enforcement databases, suggesting either the firearm had not been used in other documented crimes or had not been previously recovered by authorities for testing and database entry. The projectile analysis provided information about the type and caliber of weapon used, though without the actual firearm for comparison. This information had limited investigative value beyond narrowing the range of weapons that could have been involved. The motive for the shooting has never been established through the investigation. The immediate nature of the shooting upon door opening suggested either the perpetrator intended to harm Dixon specifically and shot as soon as the opportunity presented, or the encounter involved mistaken identity with the perpetrator, believing they were shooting someone else who they expected to find at that address. The fact that Dixon was armed when she answered suggests she may have anticipated potential danger. Though whether this anticipation was based on specific threats she had received, knowledge of who might be seeking her, or general caution given recent events in her life remains unclear from available information. Alternative theories include the possibility that the shooting resulted from a dispute Dixon had been involved in prior to her relocation to the apartment, with someone tracking her to the new address to carry out retaliation. The robbery motive seems less likely, given that the shooting occurred immediately upon door opening without any attempt to enter the apartment or demand valuables. If the perpetrator had intended robbery, the typical pattern would involve forcing entry or compelling Dixon to allow access rather than shooting her at the threshold and fleeing. The case has remained a cold file with Houston Police Department, with limited public updates about investigative progress in the decades since 2000. Another case would provide extensive video evidence, yet remain equally frustrating. Elizabeth Barraza. On January 25, 2019, 29-year-old Elizabeth Barraza was setting up items for a garage sale in the driveway of her Tomball residence when a vehicle approached and an individual exited. The individual shot Barraza 4 times before returning to the vehicle and fleeing the scene. The entire encounter lasted mere seconds, captured on residential surveillance cameras that recorded both the approach and departure of the suspect vehicle. Barraza was transported to a medical facility where she succumbed to her injuries, having been unable to provide investigators with information about her assailant before her passing. The speed and precision of the attack suggested premeditation and specific targeting rather than random selection of a victim during a crime of opportunity. Barraza had been preparing for the garage sale in order to fund an anniversary trip with her husband Sergio. She was known in the community for her involvement in cosplay activities, particularly her membership in the 501st Legion, a Star Wars costume organization that participates in charity events and conventions. She maintained interests in both Star Wars and Harry Potter fandoms, dedicating substantial time and resources to creating elaborate costumes and participating in fan community gatherings. The garage sale was intended to sell items to generate funds for travel, a routine activity that would not typically generate safety concerns. Her youngest sibling status in the family and close relationships with parents and brother Robert created a tight-knit family unit that was devastated by her sudden passing. Surveillance footage captured the suspect vehicle, identified as a Nissan Frontier pickup truck, arriving in the neighborhood shortly before the shooting. The vehicle had been observed passing Barraza's residence multiple times in the period before the shooting, suggesting reconnaissance or surveillance to determine when she would be outside and vulnerable. This repeated passing indicated the perpetrator had been monitoring Barraza's activities and waiting for an opportunity when she would be alone and accessible. The driver exited wearing what appeared to be disguise, consisting of a long dress or robe and a blonde wig, including what some observers characterized as possibly a wig or other head covering, making identification of gender and physical characteristics difficult despite the video evidence. After the shooting, the vehicle departed rapidly, with tracking attempts unsuccessful in determining its ultimate destination or recovering the vehicle for forensic examination. The investigation has explored numerous theories about motive and perpetrator identity. Authorities have indicated they believe the shooting was a targeted attack rather than a random act, with some investigators suggesting the possibility of a hired arrangement given the deliberate nature of the approach and rapid execution. Reconnaissance pattern observed in the surveillance footage supports this theory, as does the efficiency with which the shooting was carried out without any apparent interaction or confrontation beyond the immediate attack. However, Investigators have not publicly identified who might have wanted Barraza harmed or what grievances might have motivated such an act. Examination of her personal and professional relationships revealed no obvious conflicts or disputes that would explain targeting her for elimination. The cosplay community involvement has been examined as a potential source of conflict, though no evidence has emerged suggesting disputes within fan organizations or conventions that would escalate to hiring someone for harm. Barraza's charitable work through the 501st Legion involved hospital visits to patients, particularly those receiving treatment for serious conditions, bringing joy through costume appearances. This altruistic activity would not typically generate the level of animosity required to motivate a planned attack. The investigation has also considered whether the targeting might have involved mistaken identity, with the perpetrator intending to harm someone else who lived at or near the address, though the reconnaissance pattern suggests specific surveillance of Barraza, rather than confusion about target identity. Sergio Barraza, Elizabeth's husband, participated in interviews in 2020, providing information about their relationship and emphasizing that he knew of no one who would have wished his wife harm. The couple had been married several years and maintained what family and friends described as a stable, affectionate relationship without indications of domestic discord. Sergio's cooperation with the investigation and his public appeals for information have been consistent, with authorities clearing him of involvement early in the investigation. Robert and Rosemary Newell, Elizabeth's parents, have spoken publicly about their ongoing grief, with Robert stating, "Grief comes in waves," as they continue seeking resolution years after their daughter's passing. The family has maintained active involvement in keeping the case in public awareness, providing interviews and supporting publicity efforts designed to generate tips. A $50,000 reward has been offered for information leading to the identification and arrest of the perpetrator. While no formal murder charges were filed by late 2025, the Harris County Sheriff's Office announced in early 2025 that they had recovered a Nissan Frontier in another state that matched the suspect vehicle's unique modifications, and they are currently conducting advanced DNA vacuum (MVAC) testing on the interior. The next case would demonstrate how some families wait decades for even basic answers. Andrew and Estela Salinas. On Christmas Day, 1980, the bodies of 31-year-old Estela Salinas and her 3-year-old son, Andrew Salinas, were discovered near White Oak Bayou. Estela had been strangled, while Andrew's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation-strangulation as well. Both had been taken through strangulation, with forensic examination documenting the method used to end their lives. The ligature marks and positioning of the bodies provided investigators with information about how the strangulation had been accomplished, though the specific implement or technique used could not be definitively established from the condition of the remains when discovered. The family's 1974 Chevrolet Chevelle was found abandoned on East 33rd Street, several miles from the bayou where the bodies were discarded, suggesting the killer drove the victim's car to the dumping site before ditching it. Estela Salinas had been the mother of multiple offspring, including sons Gilbert and Stephen, and a daughter Dolores. The family structure indicated Estela was the primary caregiver, and her relationship with her son, who died alongside her, suggested they had been together when they encountered the perpetrator or were targeted as a unit. The Christmas Day timing of the discovery added particular tragedy to the case, with the family's holiday forever marked by the loss of 2 members. The fact that both mother and son were taken together suggested either they had been targeted as a unit by someone who wished harm to both, or they had encountered the perpetrator under circumstances where both became victims rather than one being eliminated while the other witnessed and was then harmed to prevent identification and testimony. The strangulation of 2 individuals requires either compliance from the victims, overwhelming physical advantage by the perpetrator, or the presence of multiple perpetrators who could control both. victims simultaneously. The investigation explored whether Estela and her son had been strangled sequentially, with one forced to witness the other's demise before being taken themselves, or whether two perpetrators had acted in concert to eliminate both victims at the same time. The emotional trauma inherent in either scenario added to the brutality of the offense, particularly given the mother-son relationship and the Christmas timing that should have been spent in family celebration rather than tragedy. The investigation pursued leads related to individuals who had known Estela Salinas and who might have had access to her and her son during the time frame preceding their demise. Family members, friends, and associates were interviewed to establish Estela's activities on Christmas Day and to identify anyone who might have had grievances or disputes with her. However, no substantial suspects emerged from these inquiries. The strangulation method indicated close physical contact between perpetrator and victims, requiring either sufficient trust that approach was possible without immediate defensive response, or an ambush scenario where resistance could be overcome through surprise or overwhelming force. The fact that both victims were strangled, rather than killed through more rapid methods like gunshot, suggested either the perpetrator lacked access to firearms or preferred strangulation for reasons related to noise reduction, personal gratification, or control dynamics. The transportation of the bodies to the bayou location indicated the perpetrator had access to a vehicle and knowledge of the area's geography sufficient to select a disposal site that would delay discovery. The bayou area provided water access and vegetation that might conceal remains, though the bodies were discovered relatively quickly, preventing extensive decomposition that might have complicated forensic analysis. The selection of a separate location for abandoning the family vehicle suggested an attempt to create confusion about the sequence of events and the locations where different stages of the crime occurred. The abandoned vehicle provided potential forensic evidence, though the technology available in 1980 limited what could be extracted and analyzed. Fingerprint analysis was conducted, though any prints recovered either matched the victims and family members who normally used the vehicle or could not be identified through the databases available at that time. The interior of the vehicle was examined for biological evidence, fibers, or other trace materials that might link to a perpetrator, though any evidence collected either degraded before DNA analysis became available or did not generate matches when tested against criminal databases in subsequent decades. The passage of over 4 decades has meant that much of the original evidence has degraded beyond usefulness, and witnesses who might have provided information have either passed away or can no longer recall details with the specificity needed for investigative advancement. The motive for the taking of both Estela and her son has never been established through the investigation. Theories have ranged from personal grievances against Estela that resulted in her son being eliminated as a witness, to robbery that escalated beyond the perpetrator's initial intentions when victims resisted or when the perpetrator decided to eliminate witnesses, to random targeting by someone seeking vulnerable victims. The Christmas Day timing may have been coincidental, with the perpetrator acting based on opportunity rather than selecting the date deliberately, though this remains speculation without evidence establishing the timeline of when the strangulation occurred versus when the bodies were discovered. The case remains unsolved, with Texas Rangers maintaining it as an open cold case and encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Family members have expressed hope that someone in the public possesses information about what occurred, whether through direct knowledge or through having heard statements from individuals involved. The decades without resolution have created lasting trauma for surviving family members, including Gilbert, Stephen, and Dolores, who continue to seek answers about why Estela and her brother were targeted and who was responsible for ending their lives on a day that should have been spent in celebration rather than tragedy. The case demonstrates the particular challenges in solving cases from the 1980s, when forensic capabilities were limited and when the passage of time has eroded both evidence and witness memories. Yet another woman would vanish from her home under mysterious circumstances. Detta D. Taylor Maris. On July 14, 1990, 35-year-old Detta D. Taylor Maris disappeared from her residence in Pasadena, Texas. While she lived in Pasadena with her family, Detta was actually last seen leaving a convenience store on Red Bluff Road on July 14, 1990. Shortly before her vehicle was found abandoned with her purse and keys still inside. The circumstances suggested she had not planned to leave, as personal belongings remained at the residence. Her husband reported her missing, though investigators noted he provided limited information about her activities before she vanished. Detta's remains were discovered on March 27, 1991, in a field near FM 1409 in Liberty County. The discovery was made by a farmer preparing the land for planting. The body had undergone substantial decomposition, complicating forensic examination. However, sufficient evidence remained for medical examiners to rule the manner as homicide, establishing that Detta had been the victim of intentional harm. The investigation focused on reconstructing her movements and identifying who might have had opportunity to encounter her. The fact that she disappeared from her home suggested either she left voluntarily with someone she trusted, or she was taken by force without neighbors observing suspicious activity. The transportation to Liberty County indicated the perpetrator had selected a disposal location removed from where Detta lived. The case remains unsolved and is part of a series of cold cases that have challenged Pasadena Police Department. The passage of over 3 decades has meant witnesses have aged or passed away, and memories have faded. The final case would end a life just as it was beginning anew. Toni Ann Ackerman. On August 19, 1992, 26-year-old Toni Ann Ackerman was discovered deceased in a bar ditch in Guadalupe County, Texas. She had been shot multiple times, with forensic examination documenting that the projectiles had caused fatal injuries. Ackerman had been observed in the company of an unidentified man prior to her demise, providing investigators with a potential lead about who might have been the last person to see her alive. However, this individual was never definitively identified, and the description provided by witnesses who saw them together was insufficient to generate successful identification efforts. Toni Ackerman was a longtime resident of New Braunfels and had only been married for 2 weeks when she was killed. Her vehicle was found abandoned at a gas station in Seguin, separate from where her body was located. The fact that she was newly married raised questions about whether her demise was connected to relationships from before the marriage, to conflicts arising within the marriage, or to an encounter with someone unrelated to her personal life. Investigators pursued inquiries into her background, examining both her recent marriage and any previous relationships that might have generated grievances or motivations for harm. The multiple gunshot wounds documented during forensic examination indicated the perpetrator had fired repeatedly, suggesting either intent to ensure fatality or loss of control during the shooting. The location where Ackerman's body was discovered in the bar ditch suggested she had either been shot at that location or had been transported there after being shot elsewhere. The roadside setting indicated the perpetrator had access to a vehicle and had selected a location where the body might not be immediately discovered. Though the bar ditch placement meant discovery occurred relatively quickly compared to more remote disposal sites. The investigation has stumped Guadalupe County investigators throughout the 3 decades since the shooting, with no substantial leads emerging from witness interviews or forensic analysis. The unidentified man seen with Ackerman represents the most significant potential lead, though the inability to establish his identity has prevented investigators from determining whether he was responsible for the shooting, witnessed the shooting by another party, or simply was in Ackerman's company shortly before she encountered her killer through separate circumstances. The motive for the shooting has never been established through the investigation. Theories have included personal disputes stemming from relationships, robbery that escalated to intentional harm, or targeting by someone who had developed fixation on Ackerman. The recent marriage added complexity to understanding potential motives, as investigators had to consider whether the union itself had generated conflicts with individuals from her past. In 2019, authorities announced a reward for information leading to resolution of the case, hoping that financial incentive might prompt individuals with knowledge to come forward decades after the incident. Texas Rangers maintain the case as an open investigation, reviewing it periodically as new forensic techniques become available or as investigators consider whether connections might exist to other unsolved cases in the region. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.